Episode 1 of Good Morning Veronica begins with Veronica arriving at work after her morning routine. She immediately notices something up as a strange woman starts walking around aimlessly. As we soon come to learn, this second woman is called Marta. Before arriving at the police station, she frantically sends an email in the morning which fails to get through. Nursing a blistered lip, Veronica immediately gets up to speak to her. Only, just as she does, a man brandishes a gun and points it at another accused of raping and murdering his daughter. With the officers distracted, Marta picks up the gun and shoots herself in the head. It's a shocking opener and one that catches Veronica completely off guard. Despite one of the officers filming the entire event, it seems that the police want to sweep this under the rug. Determined to get to the bottom of what's going on, Veronica heads down to the mortuary where she speaks to Prada. Marta's lip is certainly cause for concern, but it's the fingernails that alarm her the most. Deducing these are a result of depression, Veronica sets out to solve the case. We then cut across to a woman named Janet Cruz, who apologizes to her husband for miscarrying. It seems they're trying for a baby, but their attempts have thus far at least been unsuccessful. Although seemingly supportive, there's certainly some uneasiness here. The next day she requests $50 to get some nice meat for dinner. After some initial tension, he hands over the money. Through some well-shot exposition, we learn that she's being kept there against her will and has a secret stash of money she's saving up. Dinner that night is a tense affair too, as Claudio calls her worthless and admits that he knows she phoned her sister earlier on. At the station, Carlos Alberto arrives and pressures the police chief to investigate the Marta suicide case immediately. Veronica happens to be there too and encourages her uncle to give her the case. Eventually he agrees to let her look into this. Grabbing the bull by the horns, Veronica starts to learn more about Marta's life. She was senior staff for an architecture firm, single and with no kids. Marta was about to get married too, but her partner left her for a younger model. This brings her to Marta's friend Regina, who mentions a man named Pietro, the same one from the emails, and how Marta showed up with her blistered lip not long after meeting him. On her drive to the nursing home where her father happens to be, Marta receives a call from Prada. He confirms Marta had no alcohol in her system, and the blisters were actually a result of a roofie. While investigating her house, Veronica notices a strange hooded figure leaving the apartment and a torn-up picture inside the house. Are they covering up evidence or connected in some way? Back at the station, Veronica remains determined to find the root cause of what's going on. She asks Anita for details on the dating website Marta frequented, but she brushes it off like it's nothing. Nelson overhears the entire event though, and offers a lifeline in the form of his expertise. Veronica eventually learns that Marta's final words, "ideal love," are actually a double entendre. They're the name of the dating website Marta was frequenting. The investigation continues and Veronica takes to the news, telling women to get in touch if they're being abused. One of those watching happens to be Janet, but her oppressive partner arrives and tells her they're heading out together, shutting off the TV. A bus pulls up from Sao Luis and a young girl we've seen glimpses of this episode is cornered by Janet. She encourages her to work at their house and tells her to follow. As she heads round the corner, Claudio lies in wait with a taser. He bundles her in the car, while Janet can only sit in stunned silence. Episode 2 of Good Morning Veronica begins with Janet, blindfolded and afraid as her husband drives up into the woods. The young girl pleads for her life, while Janet is led underground to a bunker and locked with a box over her head. She scrapes her fingernails nervously, seemingly a clue leading back to Marta, and is forced to listen as Claudio abuses the young girl. Back at the police station, Veronica is pushed for answers after her stint on TV. Just then, a woman named Tainá arrives and reveals she too was abused on Ideal Love. She's even got the blistered lip for proof. Her abuser's name was Filippo, and as Anita and the chief question her, Veronica takes notes while being forced to bite her tongue. The detectives are pretty insensitive with their direct questions, but Veronica picks up on what the girl is saying. Veronica immediately believes this may be a serial predator. As work spills over to her personal life, Veronica watches her kids swimming and is forced to deal with a sibling rivalry. At the same time, she starts to look into Ideal Love. This brings her and Tainá before a computer to try and do a composite sketch for Filippo. On the back of this, Veronica speaks in private to the woman, but her methods are much more personal. She gains the woman's trust, and she reveals a picture Filippo took of her. This picture seems to match that of Marta's and could lead to the same person being involved. The picture is clearly meant to intimidate the victim, but Anita takes control of the case and leads her team. With her grudge with Veronica continuing, she gives the woman a mountain of paperwork to get through instead. Thankfully, Nelson is there and he decides to help Veronica, searching the dark web for clues. Back home, Janet is mortified over what she's witnessed. Claudio brings her breakfast in bed though and encourages her, telling the woman that everything is okay. Only, it's very clearly anything but. Prada brings back a toxicology report that seems to hint that the sedative used has traces of acid, hence the blistered lip. Just then, Nelson rings through and confirms that the culprit may well be a guy called Lucca, who brags about his victims on the dark web. With an IP address traced to a gym, Veronica heads up and finds a whole box of photos. Brandishing her gun, she confronts this gym owner, but it turns out he has an alibi for the time periods in question. He's not the guy. When Claudio leaves, Jeanette seizes her opportunity to look through photos on her phone. Importantly, she also makes a bold decision and rings through to Veronica. Nelson answers and asks for her number, but she realizes this could cause Claudio to find out, and she hangs up. Veronica meanwhile is officially added to the case, much to the captain's disdain. She's not happy with Veronica's hesitation and takes offense to her methods. When Anita brings up her father, she loses control. As we soon see, her father is a sensitive subject given he was originally accused of being a dirty cop. The pressure of that caused a serious family tragedy, namely her mother and father dying. This brings the earlier incident last episode with the suicide into perspective. Nelson comforts her on the roof and hands over the details for Jeanette. When she rings through, Janet answers in a frazzled state and tells her not to call before hanging up. This is enough for her to scout out the area, while Janet does her best to brush off this call as a telemarketer. Inside, Veronica finds out the man is an armed officer. Her investigation is interrupted though by Claudio showing up with Janet. When her phone rings, his demeanor immediately changes, and he finds her hidden stash of money and phone. With the SIM card in hand, he forces her to swallow it, while Veronica sneaks out and narrowly avoids this man. In the morning, Veronica arrives at the house while Claudio is out and asks Janet for her. Episode 3 of Good Morning Veronica begins with Veronica speaking to Janet in her house. As Janet sits nervously, her hands shaking, she's convinced herself that everything is her fault. Telling her side of the story, Janet mentions the box and the forest trips. As she goes into detail about the horrific acts that Claudio conducts, she shows her crossword puzzle. It turns out she's been using this to fool Claudio and write down important dates and names, including one name labeled USA. The cycle of abuse has been getting worse, the catalyst of which stemming from Janet's constant miscarriages. With her unwilling to testify, Veronica pleads with the woman to give her some time to try and gather evidence to put him away. Back at the station, Veronica goes over what she's learned and tries to figure out the next course of action. Veronica tasks Nelson with trying to track down Claudio's movements, down to the minute. Elsewhere, Janet receives a surprise visitor when her sister Janice arrives. Claudio is less than enthused, but he keeps up the facade and lets her stay for the night. It turns out Janet's mom has cancer, and she's in line for public health at the hospital. It doesn't look good for her, and worse, treatment is expensive. Claudio throws a bone though, and promises to check his bank balance to help. Alone, Janet apologizes to her husband, but he simply tells her to rest, making a point of calling her little bird again. The next day, Anita has a big break and tries to catch the culprit from the dark web out in the open. Their play is a backpack exchange for the photographs, but this guy is smart. Paying off a man to pose in his place, Anita apprehends the wrong suspect, and the real guy slips through her fingers. Veronica is not happy, especially given she warned something like this would happen, and gets back to more conventional ways of searching. This involves checking the CCTV footage from that day with Tainá's help. She notices a guy snapping photos, but also engaging in a strange neck twitch. This matches the same mannerisms that Filippo allegedly had too. The group deduce they found their guy and turned to a more conventional way of baiting the man out of hiding, and that comes from a dating profile on Ideal Love. It turns out Claudio has a completely clean license and no previous felonies to his name. This means Veronica and the other officers are at a difficult moment in the investigation and unsure where to turn next. After an awkward encounter the previous night with Claudio, Janet is given some breathing room when her husband heads to work. It's just the opportunity Janice needs too, and she tries to bring her sister back to her old fun-loving self. Janice encourages Janet to head out with her while dressed provocatively, but she only manages to make it halfway down the drive before she gets cold feet. Sitting at the kitchen table, Janice pleads with her sister to open up. Claudio senses her meddling when he returns too and offers to drive Janice down to the airport. Only he doesn't drive her there. Instead, he drops her off in the middle of an alleyway. When Janice tries to scramble out of sight, Claudio stalks the girl and points a gun directly at her head, threatening to shoot. Meanwhile, Veronica is caught in a difficult position. She has little to go on, and Janet is obviously too afraid to testify against her husband. Unfortunately, Claudio goes one step further when he heads home and starts cutting off Janet's hair. This is another shocking example of abuse, and one that closes out this episode on a pretty grim note. Episode 4 of Good Morning Veronica begins with Veronica arriving at Janet's house and pleading with her to talk. Veronica tells Janet she needs to find evidence against her husband to press charges. As they sit together, Janet shows her chopped hair and hangs her head in shame. Only, this serves as a fuel needed for Veronica to press on with this case. Desperate to find the ranch, Veronica heads back to the station and speaks to Nelson about what he's uncovered. After an icy reception from Anita, Veronica remains home, but her work follows. Paulo and Vero visit the exact same restaurant that Marta went to. However, Paulo doesn't seem too deterred, and for now their relationship remains stable. After her chat with Veronica, Janet phones her mother and learns that Janice hasn't returned home yet. This leads her to the chilling realization that Claudio's next victim may very well have been her own flesh and blood. Prada introduces Veronica to her friend Anita, who helps shed more light on the case. Specifically, she talks about the box and its psychological impact on Janet. The cutting hair is next level and could well be the next step toward murder itself. Given Claudio is part of the military police, this only complicates matters further as time continues to tick away on this case. Instead, Veronica turns her attention to Tainá. As she digs into the woman's past, it turns out she had surgery. Given Marta did too, it seems the one thing linking these victims together is that they each had surgery. This certainly narrows down the list of people responsible. Unfortunately, that's the least of Veronica's problems. When Veronica heads home, she finds a police car parked across the street and senses it could be Claudio. However, that doesn't deter her as she heads in and starts siphoning through a list of prospective matches until she finds the predator online. She poses as a woman recently out of surgery with a scar across her belly and manages to bag a date for that night. Annoyingly, Anita takes control of the case and takes it away from Vero. She even goes so far as to clap sarcastically when she asks to be the one taking out Giorgio. Acting professionally, Veronica brushes aside the coldness and works with Anita to track down this man whose real name is Gregorio Duarte. Cornering him outside, they bring him in for questioning, along with a slew of evidence pointing at him as the culprit. With the case closed, Anita takes all the praise, much to Veronica's annoyance. Carvana and Anita takes control of the interview, while Veronica works with the rest of the group to sift through the mountain of evidence they now have. Veronica finds a whole box full of shoes, 23 different pairs to be precise. Unfortunately, their worst fears about being a serial offender ring true. On the back of Veronica's hard work, Carvana approaches his niece and offers her a new opportunity. Only, Vero refuses to leave until the case with Janet is wrapped up and solved. Speaking of which, Janet starts to pull away from Claudio, but his hold is too strong. He turns the story again and tells her that Janice never wanted to be near her. She only arrived for the money, not to see her. Convicting Janet that she already has a family, Claudio doubles his efforts and heads back out with another victim. This time though, Janet does her best to remember every single step taken. This continues with her removing the box from her head and studying the room and the victim. Plucking up enough courage, she exits out the bunker and starts trying to find evidence to pin against Claudio. As she starts rooting around, she spies Claudio with a strange old lady who appears to be doing a ritual. As Janet looks over, she's Episode 5 of Good Morning Veronica begins with more glimpses of the past, as we see what happened with Veronica's father on the fateful night her mother was killed. This eventually catches us up to the present, where Veronica heads into the nursing home to celebrate her father's birthday. Janet meanwhile feels Claudio's wrath. When she awakens, bruises plague her face and she can barely talk. Claudio also receives a visit from a mole, informing her that someone from civil police is checking him out. Acting fast, Claudio heads into the police station and requests to speak to Anita. As he does, Veronica receives a call from Janet who confirms that she took the box off and may hold crucial clues for her. Racing up to her house, Veronica is shocked to see Janet's bruises and snaps photos for evidence. This incredibly brave woman shows her sketches she took from that night. The latest victim was called Jessica, and she goes on to mention the scarred old woman she saw before Claudio beat her down. On the back of this, Veronica tries to work out whether the ranch belongs to a relative or not. As she leaves with the sketches, she tasks Janet with trying to track Claudio's phone in real time. Vero takes everything she's gathered so far and speaks to Carvana. She's convinced Claudio's a serial killer, but her uncle is having none of it. Instead, she heads out and finds Tainá, who bitterly reveals that Gregorio has been released from custody. There's certainly no justice here given what he's done. Elsewhere, Janet starts searching through Claudio's things, including a key to a sketchbook holding drawings of birds in cages. His little bird, if you will. It also has more clues surrounding his sick obsession with hurting these girls. Crucially, it also holds 2 pictures from his childhood. Nelson continues to help with Veronica's case, suggesting they plan to track her on Janet rather than Claudio. That way it should trace them all the way back to Claudio's hideout. Unfortunately, Veronica isn't able to act further as she learns her case is being given to Anita. As she heads out the room, she leaves her phone to record the conversation. There, she hears firsthand that corruption in the police goes all the way up to the top. Somehow Anita and Carvana both know what a monster Claudio is, and they're doing everything they can to stop him being investigated. Upon hearing this, Vero is understandably angry and screams to the heavens outside. Not long after, she heads to Prada and shows him the audio recording. He encourages her to drop the case. Claudio is part of the dangerous military police, and everyone in these parts know not to mess with them. Unfortunately, Carvana only cares about burying the case, and it leaves Veronica stuck and unsure where to turn next. Janet meanwhile sacrifices a lot after getting Claudio drunk. She manages to hack into his phone and find the tracking number Veronica needs. After writing it down, she phones through and passes on the number. In order to nip this case in the bud, Veronica passes over a recording device to her. This comes in the form of earrings which Janet wears graciously. All she needs now is a confession. In order to get that, Claudio returns home and asks for a kiss after every question. She begins by asking about his parents, but the evidence isn't enough to incriminate him. With snippets of evidence being gained, Veronica confronts Carvana over the case. She calls him corrupt, and Carvana's response is a swift slap across the face. Unsure what else to do, Veronica receives word that Claudio is heading to the bus station and realizes another victim is imminent. Wearing her police badge, she takes Carvana's car and races to the station to try and stop what's about to take place. However, Janet gets there first and does her usual gig for an unsuspecting girl. Before Veronica can get there, armed men almost run her off the road and gun her down. As Veronica speeds away, the episode leaves everything resting on a precarious night. Episode 6 of Good Morning Veronica begins with Claudio about to strike again. He captures the young girl, bundling her in the boot of his car. At the same time, Vero evades the armed men and races up to follow Janet's signal. Claudio stops the car in the woods and forces Janet underground to the bunker. Predictably, the signal is weak there, prompting Veronique to use her wits to try and detect the exact location. She doesn't get much, but Veronica does confirm Janet is in the basement. Snatching up the bloodied young girl, the duo scramble to safety as Nelson's brilliant transmitters start to lose their strength. Unfortunately, gunshots pierce the air as Claudio is back on the rampage and holds Janet up at gunpoint while she's trying to escape from him. Claudio doesn't kill her, but does hold her captive inside the house with locked doors and, as she soon finds out, security cameras. When Claudio returns, he confronts her over the phone call she almost made earlier in the day. Janet spins the story to include phoning her sister. It turns out Janice is still alive, but Claudio's clearly had his way with her. Hearing through to Janice, but she tells Janet not to call and avoid speaking to her. Veronica awakens to find herself back home after having a bit of a panic attack out in the woods. With her mission a failure, she's forced to listen to the audio snippets from the night before while bitterly bemoaning her luck. Beating herself up, Veronica speaks to her husband who tells her the boat is sinking and she's losing sight of her family life. To make matters worse, Nelson arrives with flowers and bread for the family. This only causes a further wedge to form between Paulo and Vero as Nelson sits with her privately and discusses the case. Given what happened to her out on the street, Nelson worries that her number may be up, especially if Claudio knows who she is. When Veronica heads outside, paranoia consumes her. She immediately goes to Janet's house and tries to convince the woman to help and give her another chance. Given what she's sacrificed to the cause, Janet blames herself for the poor girl dying and shuns Veronica. On the back of this, Janet flushes the earrings down the toilet to prevent more harm being done to her. That evening, Janet uses the security cameras to figure out some of Claudio's secrets. He's been stashing photos from his childhood inside the Virgin Mary inside the living room. As Janet creeps over and looks in the statue, she finds pictures in there of Claudio as a baby. Notably, he's also scratched off the face of his mother. Veronica turns back to Prada and starts to realize that this death squad that went after her was intentional. It also appears like Carvana knew about this and willingly gave Vero his car to prevent her death. At the station, Nelson manages to track down the car that followed Vero that night. Although the license plate is a fake, the picture on the back windscreen is anything but. Midway through checking the files, Carvana gives Veronica a new case to work on. This seems like a distraction, and it's only made worse by Anita showing up with a bruised arm. The same arm from one of the masked assailants she backed into. Does this mean the police are in on this? Realizing she can't trust anyone, Veronica heads out and back to her father, while Anita watches from afar. When she leaves, Anita arrives before Veronica's father, Julio. She stubs a cigarette out on his palm as the scene cuts across to show Veronica at home consoling her daughter. Their dog has been killed upstairs and worse, on the wall is a picture of the inpatient files for her father. If that wasn't bad enough, Janet finds out she's pregnant. Phew, talk about a trippy. Episode 7 of Good Morning Veronica begins with Veronica racing up to find her dad after the incident at her house. There, she sees firsthand the cigarette burn on Julio's hand. Realizing that someone was there before her, Veronica wonders whether it may be Anita. This inevitably brings her to Carvana, who gives her a get-out-of-jail-free card. This comes in the form of a trip away with her family. Veronica has a trump card of her own, including the recording of his conversation with Anita, and refuses to leave despite the rising heat around her. Back home, Veronica breaks the news to her expectant family, sending them away while she stays behind. Paulo is not happy, and he struggles to compose himself in the wake of how selfish she's being. Veronica bites back, telling him she's doing this for their own protection. She wants them to go to the airport and pick a different location to cover their tracks. After saying their goodbyes, Veronica is left alone to face this threat. Speaking of alone, Janet stands up to Claudio and tells him she doesn't want to go out again. She also presents the pictures she found to him, confronting the man outright about his past and just why he's been hurting all those girls. Defiantly telling her he's nothing like his father, Janet's urgent and panicked tone raises his suspicions that she may be talking to someone else. As things turn heated, she admits to being pregnant. On the back of this bombshell reveal, Claudio promises not to hurt the girls anymore. Veronica also learns about Janet's pregnancy, but she doesn't want anything to do with her anymore. She vows to tell Claudio they've been talking and walks away. If things couldn't get worse for Veronica, think again. Nelson heads over later that day and reveals some disturbing news about Tainá. She's dead. Her death has been declared a suicide, but Veronica knows there's more going on here. At the station, she brushes aside Anita's cold greeting and starts sifting through files in her office. There, she finds numerous pictures taken as surveillance against her. It looks like she's been watched for a long time. As she keeps digging, she also finds pictures of Anita as a child. Veronica heads up to a local sanctuary that used to take in kids from the street. She shows the woman their pictures of Anita as a child and asks if she recognizes her. Old Shifty Eyes is clearly frazzled and shuts the door on Veronica. Well, we'll take that as a yes then. This inevitably leads Veronica back to her father's final case, determined to see if there's a link between Anita and Julio Torres. Given the painful memories this digs up, Veronica struggles to maintain a level heading in the case. Eventually this leads her back to Prada, who confirms her own suspicions. Carvana covered for Julio, pretending he was dead to protect him from the powers that be. Those powers seemingly including Anita. Anita appears to have been planted in the police station by this higher group, groomed from a young age for a specific purpose that as of yet is still unknown. Given Prada was still kicking in the station back then, Veronica comments how it's a little suspect that he's unscathed from what happened to Julio. Prada simply shrugs, telling her ignorance is sometimes best. Meanwhile, Janet presses Claudio to find out more about the box on her head. It turns out this is a way of protecting her from what he does. When Claudio leaves for the day, Janet uses her wits to hide from the cameras. She phones Nice, asking her how Mom is. She doesn't have a lot to report, but signs off with "May God protect your child." Well, God seemingly sends a sign for her. This comes in the form of a vial of poison in the bins with a sign reading "Protect your child." Back inside the house, Claudio has a surprise for her. He's made a crib for their baby in the workshop. Interestingly, the camera is framed in such a way to show the tools behind her hanging up, juxtaposing the violence with this single ray of hope. Unfortunately, this isn't enough for Claudio to change his mind about hurting young girls. He tells Janet to get dressed and ignores her pleas to stop. With Claudio out and grabbing the girl like before, Janet seizes her opportunity and puts the poison inside a bubbling kettle. Only, this poison is drunk by the old woman outside, who happens to be Claudio's grandmother. In horror, Claudio is forced to watch his own flesh and blood die before his eyes. Claudio is beside himself with grief-stricken anger, and he heads back to the basement. He finds Janet helping the poor girl and the empty poison vial too. Putting two and two together, Claudio handcuffs his wife to the chair, puts the box back on her head, and sets the girl alight. As she burns, Claudio watches his wife burn alive. Episode 8 and finale recap. An out-of-control Veronica begins Good Morning Veronica with an impassioned plea to those watching on her phone. In order to protect the ones we love, we must make the difficult decisions. As she starts sobbing, we cut back 24 hours earlier. Carvana finds Vero snooping around her office and questions what she's doing. Only, Vero is the one asking questions now, and she talks to him about her father's death hit and just what happened in the past. It turns out her father was part of this entire operation, but he wanted to speak up and reveal the truth. Carvana ended up involved thanks to a series of favors, but he claims to just be a small fish. Gritting her teeth, Veronica demands to know who the bosses are. Getting nowhere, she instead drops her badge and gun on the table. This isn't a good idea though, and as Carvana tells her, the police force is her only shield right now. Instead, he gives her an unregistered gun wrapped in a cloth and tells her to go somewhere safe and lay low. That evening, Veronica FaceTimes her family and tells Paula what happened, including handing in her badge at the station. Sobbing, Vero tells her family she loves them very much and packs her suitcase. Meanwhile, Claudio buries his wife up at the ranch before heading back to the house. He collects up all of Janet's clothes and belongings, stuffing them in a bag. However, he hesitates when he notices the crossword puzzles and a series of numbers. Ringing through, he gets Carvana's number at homicide and immediately hangs up. Veronica makes her decision and heads over to Janet's house. Turning off the electric fan with her gun in hand, she sneaks inside and finds the house completely abandoned and stripped bare. All of Janet's belongings are gone. Some of the crossword puzzles are still there though, and as Vero looks through the pages, she realizes this links back to the location of the ranch. Before she can continue though, Nelson rings and reveals that Carvana has gone missing. As we've seen from an earlier scene, he was tasered and carried away by Claudio. Vero uses the clues in the crossword puzzle to try and suss out where Claudio's ranch is. It seems to work too, and she finds the car abandoned and the boot wide open. Grabbing the taser from the front seat, she sneaks round the corner and finds Claudio digging a grave. A blood-stained Claudio lies motionless on the ground. Unblinking, Vero points the gun at Claudio's chest and fires. Only, he turns the gun on Carvana and fires. Vero is forced to watch this man die before her eyes. Overcome with grief, Veronica tries to compose herself while hunting for a wounded Claudio through the woods. This hunt inevitably brings her to the bunker, where she finds Claudio lying in wait. He pounces on her, but she tasers him and leaves the man in a heap on the ground. Putting the box over his head, she burns him alive after seeing what he did to Janet. On the back of this, Veronica heads off to speak to Chief Carlos. She organizes a meeting in private to discuss what's been happening at the station. Nelson rings while she's en route though, and reveals that she's the main suspect in Claudio's death. It turns out the chief is working with Anita too, leaving Veronica with yet another roadblock to tackle. With nowhere else to turn, Vero leaves the message for herself on the bridge and turns the gun on herself and fires. We then cut forward 2 months. The police find the ranch and 15 dead bodies outside. Only 9 have been recognized thus far, and Vero is presumed dead. As we soon see, she's actually still alive, but adopting Janet's identity and hiding out at Prada's apartment. Determined to continue hiding from her family, she's instead going to take down this mafia infesting Brazil. She's not going to the press though, and instead decides to do things her way. As we cut across to a choking Gregorio in a restaurant, it appears her way is poisoning and killing. The episode review. Oh dear, this show completely went off the rails at the end. Turning full Jason Bourne on us, Good Morning Veronica is another example of a show abandoning what made it so good to begin with in order to chase thrills. When this Brazilian crime drama leaned into the abuse and the issues gripping young women, it was at its strongest. The cat and mouse game was good with Claudio, and there were genuine stakes in the form of Janet's life, family and well-being to keep things tense. Now that Janet is dead and Vero's killed Claudio, there's just not enough intrigue with the corrupt police angle to carry this show forward. We've seen this angle a million times before, and there's just not enough to have this stand out next to other crime dramas. A second season will almost certainly see this turn into an espionage thriller, which is a bit of a shame. That's to say nothing of Veronica either, who turns from a straight cop at the beginning to a full-on killer at the end. Her moral compass and desire to do right by the law and these girls is partly what made her such an empathetic character. Now, we're seeing her poisoning people and satisfyingly watching people burn. It loses what made her so compelling despite this serving as a commentary about corruption. If a second season is greenlit, I hope this show returns to what made it so appealing. With Vero on the run and a more thriller-esque story on the horizon though, this one is in danger of falling into action-driven mediocrity.